Let's take a closer look at some of the songs associated with this 1967 period, leading up to Sgt. Pepper and on Sgt. Pepper itself. We'll start with a couple of John songs. Strawberry Fields, an important record that we already talked about, might have been on Sgt. Pepper, but certainly is part of this new studio orientation kind of thing. The lyrics, as we've talked about before, about John's childhood, about growing up next to this place, Strawberry Fields, and the songs really seem to again express this idea of not really being sure of himself. Is it that he's so smart, or is it that he's just misunderstood, or is it that he's just, you know, strange or an outsider or whatever it is, but it's him sort of musing on these things. Again, if you want to take this back, you might think about taking it back to something like Help, where it's a similar kind of, you know, musing on my own. Is my image of myself consistent with who I really am? Am I meeting other people's expectations? This kind of thing. It's really that kind of a theme. Interesting because, you know, I've made a big point of how many of these John Lennon lyrics from this time are prompted by found or received things, right? So here's one that really is much more confessional. Critics would say navel-gazing, but nevertheless it's one of these kinds of things where he's really trying to come up with what it is he's thinking and what it is that he's feeling. There were two versions of this song recorded, and John liked the first half of one of them and the second half of the other one. So he told George Martin, can't we just put the two of them together? Just splice them together, George. And George said, well, there's a problem. They're in different keys and they're at different tempos. Well, John Lennon said to George Martin, you'll find a way. And off he went to have tea somewhere. So George Martin found that if he slowed the one that was higher and faster down a bit, and the one that was slower and lower up, there was a place where they could be joined, and they would be in the same key and at about the same tempo. And so that's exactly what happens. And so about where you hear the cellos come in is where that splice occurs on the thing. But it shows that the actual sound of what you're hearing is not even a true recording of what was recorded, because when tapes are sped up and slowed down, it changed the timbre of the instruments and the timbre of the voices. So this really is a very strongly electronically mediated recording by virtue of this process. Like a lot of these things that we're talking about now, that's the deal. Of course, we see the use of strings here, the use of backward tape in the thing, and a very kind of dreamy, eerie kind of environment that's created. At the very beginning, Paul McCartney demonstrates in the anthology the use of an early sampler called the mellotron, which actually used real magnetic tape to reproduce each note. In this case, flutes at the very beginning is used at the beginning of this. So they're looking around again for more different kinds of instruments. So there's both mellotron and real strings on this. Maybe the most controversial part of Strawberry Fields is not only the way it fades back in, so the idea that the Beatles would play a little trick on disc jockeys who would typically leave a record fade out on a turntable while they talked over it, and just as it seemed like this song was fading out, it starts to fade back in again. So while the DJ is doing whatever his rap is at the end of the tune, all of a sudden the music comes back in again. So the idea of playing with the idea of fade in, much like they'd done with 8 Days a Week, where that song kind of fades in and builds at the beginning. Now they sort of fade out and fade back in again. And at the end of it, to amuse everybody, because the name of the song is Strawberry Fields, John Lennon says over the microphone, cranberry sauce. He says cranberry sauce, but some people heard, I buried Paul. And in 1969, a disc jockey in Detroit by the name of Russ Gibb broadcast a show based on a story that appeared in the Michigan Daily, the student newspaper of the University of Michigan, that proposed the theory that Paul McCartney had actually died in a car and been replaced by a look-alike, and there were clues throughout all of the Beatles records. And I'm not going to go through all that nonsense, but check it on the internet. You'll find all of the evidence and all of that kind of thing. Of course, the entire thing makes no sense at all. But anyway, this is the beginning, cranberry sauce. The second John Lennon song we're going to look at really does something in many ways similar, but in many ways different. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite also uses some avant-garde kind of techniques and tendencies, coming from the recording studio, but is one of these songs that uses a received text. So in this case, John Lennon found a circus poster, a late 19th century, early 20th century circus poster. You can see there's a picture of him sort of standing next to it in his house. That's a fairly famous picture. You'll probably be able to find it on the internet. And in many ways, he's almost reading directly off the circus poster as he does the lyrics for the song, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. It's changed a little bit, but this reminds us again of something like Tomorrow Never Knows, where he's reading in a certain way, a paraphrased way, from the back portions of the Timothy Leary book, The Psychedelic Experience. What's interesting to this, it's as avant-garde as some of what it does is, it really is still in AABA form. So in the midst of all of this avant-garde experimentation, there's some very traditional elements. We talked about the use of chance technique in A Day of the Life. Here, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite is another chance technique that occurs. They couldn't find a kind of a steam organ, which is what they really wanted to kind of get the kind of organ that you might find on a merry-go-round. They couldn't get exactly that to work out to get the right kind of bizarre effect to create this otherworldly weirdness that Lennon was going for. So they took recordings they had of steam organs in the Abbey Road studios as kind of sound effects, or just kind of standard kind of things you would use for like a radio show or something like that. And they put them onto tape, and then took the tape and cut it up into little pieces, threw all the pieces up in the air, and then recombine them in whatever order they happen to come back, they'd happen to put them back together in. So they created by chance this backwash of sound that made in some ways absolutely no sense, and used that to create the kind of ambience that appears at a couple points in the tune. And again, there's this celebration or this experimentation with kind of avant-garde approaches to get new kinds of sounds. Back in the days before, digital technology and before synthesizers were really even very developed and all this, the only way you could get a lot of these interesting sounds, at least given the resources they had, were to just take the things around you and just kind of recombine them in crazy ways nobody had done. And that's what happens in Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. We come to Penny Lane now, and the two Paul songs that we'll talk about. Penny Lane, again, a song relating, like Strawberry Fields, to the Beatles' past in Liverpool. This one, a couple of the one of the easiest things to talk about first is the use of the piccolo trumpet. In this case, the piccolo trumpet is like a standard trumpet, but it plays higher. And if you know the Bach Brandenburg Concerto No. 2, it's the featured instrument. That's kind of the big tune. If you play piccolo trumpet, the Bach Brandenburg Concerto No. 2. Paul had heard that. Piece, and said, well, we should use that instrument. I just heard this wonderful, really high trumpet, and George Martin said, well, I know that guy. We'll get him in here. So they brought the guy in that who played with the orchestra that Paul had heard, and they worked through a part. And the piccolo trumpet is used to give it a sort of a classical flourish and flair, not unlike the use of the French horn in For No One that we heard in Revolver, and we talked about that when we were talking about that song before. The two things that I would like to talk about as special properties of this. One is how the progressive presentation of the lyrics goes. Now, we've been watching a lot of Paul songs for kind of progressive presentation of lyrics, that is, presenting things in a certain kind of order. Either, Eleanor Rigby, Father Mackenzie, the two of them together, or the developing of these various metaphors as they go. Now, he's talking about all the different people you might find in this Penny Lane, which is almost like a kind of, it's a roundabout, but in the roundabout there are shops, and so it's almost like a sort of a city center kind of thing, where there are all kinds of different people blending together. There's a bus stop there, or a tram stop, so if you get on it, people are coming and going from all kinds of different places. So all the different people you'll see, right? So he talks about a barber, he talks about a banker, he talks about a fireman, as each of these verses unfold. But then at the very end, he brings all of these characters together in the last verse. So there's a kind of a progressive presentation and a bringing together at the end, not unlike what he does with Eleanor Rigby. The other, maybe more music technical kind of interesting thing is the very last chorus of the tune. Paul actually shifts the chorus up, changes the key, takes it up by a whole step or a whole tone, takes it up from the key of A to the key of B. Now it turns out the verses in this tune are in B all the way through, and the chorus is in A. It's not that usual in one of these kinds of tunes to have verses and choruses in different keys. So it's a bit of a kind of musical problem how he's going to end the song in A if the song begins with the verse in B. So what he does is he solves that by raising the key of the chorus, doing it in A, and then doing it in B so that it ends on the same chord that it begins on. So it's a kind of an artistic solution, or a one-time solution to a kind of musical problem that he set up for himself by using two different keys in the verse and the chorus. From the point of view of composerly approach, or the artist approach, this is a nice little detail to see. It's a one-time solution to a particular musical problem. And by problem, I don't mean like something that's bad. I mean a kind of a musical situation that he's constructed for himself. A lot of times composers set these situations up just so that they can solve them. And it seems like that's exactly what's going on here. The next Paul song I want to talk about is She's Leaving Home. This one, again, follows the tradition of the use of Paul's sort of solo song with strings. Interestingly here, the one time that the strings aren't done by aren't arranged by George Martin. George Martin was unavailable, so Paul got another guy, another arranger around London by the name of Mike Leander to do the strings for this one. Anyway, we take the strings, Paul's solo song with strings, all the way back to Yesterday. Sort of comes through Michelle, which is a Paul solo song that doesn't use strings and kind of goes in a different direction, French pop, whatever it was he was doing there. Then back to the strings again with Eleanor Rigby. We spent a good deal of time talking about that. And now we've got She's Leaving Home, which again tells a story, not unlike Penny Lane in the sense that it tells a story of a girl who's leaving home. And it again employs this three-stage progression in the lyrics. The first verse tells us all about how the parents wake up in the morning and find the note from the girl. Well, no, the first verse is about the girl actually leaving home. And so she leaves home before the parents wake up. She gets out of the house and she's gone. And then the next verse tells us about how the parents wake up and find the note and realize that their child has left. And in the third verse, you skip ahead in time to her arriving at her destination, but it's not clear exactly what it is happening at the end. And in my classes, I've taught this, as I've taught this tune over the years, I've always asked the students, what do you think happens at the end? So I'll ask you, as you check out the lyrics of this, what exactly do you think happens to this girl in the third verse? Whatever happens, it's a pretty good instance, again, of this kind of building through these different stages as the lyrics unfold here. So that's what we get with She's Leaving Home. Again, when you think about the contrast between some of these songs, I mean, that's, for example, the contrast between She's Leaving Home and the next one we're going to talk about, Within You, Without You. Is this even the same band? Is this even this? Should these two things even be on the same record? But of course, they are. Within You, Without You is, in many ways, George Harrison's version of Paul's Eleanor Rigby or She's Leaving Home, because it's a George song in which no other Beatle appears and he brings in outside musicians. But rather than going to classical music and harp or the various kinds of things that Paul uses, he uses Indian musicians. Now we can go back to Love You Too as the first sort of big George Indian music tune, and of course Norwegian Wood before that, which was a John song, but on which George played the sitar for the first time. And we come to Within You, Without You. It's a modified AABA form, but what's interesting is the use of Indian musicians plus strings, and as I said before, George is the only Beatle, so he's got real Indian musicians playing the percussion parts and the various instruments there, you know, guys who really know how to do it right, not, you know, Western musicians trying to get an Indian kind of sound. He's used real Indian musicians here. It's the longest song on the album, even longer than A Day in the Life. So even though George only gets one song on this record, he'd also written a song called Only a Northern Song, which didn't make the cut for this album, ended up on the Yellow Submarine album. We'll talk about that next week. Even though it's the only song he gets 5 minutes and 5 seconds. It's a good 30 seconds longer than A Day in the Life. So he gets a pretty good piece of the action here. And as I said before, it provides a telling contrast as a solo tune to She's Leaving Home by Paul, or something like Strawberry Fields for John. Again, as you look at the lyrics, it's the George sort of Eastern philosophy thing. And so this is his enthusiastic sharing of his sort of newfound discovery of Eastern thought and some of the things that he thinks are so liberating about that. This is a pretty positive song, ultimately, when so many of his songs can also be kind of finger-wagging, and maybe some people might perceive as a little bit negative from that perspective. Well, having now spent some time talking about some of the Sgt. Pepper tunes in detail, let's take a look at what was happening in the fall of 1967. After all, after you release an album like Sgt. Pepper, what do you do for an encore? And we'll find out exactly what the Beatles did do for an encore in the fall of 1967 in the next video.